But, for everything the outgoing president is doing to mess up the transition and to have, Rudy Giuliani do these infection bonanza hearings in the swing states all over, for all they are all doing to stretch out their as yet totally fruitless legal challenges for as long as they possibly can, even though all of those challenges, dozens of them, have just been laughed out of court at every level, for this towering dust devil of nonsense they have spun every day. What about the crimey stuff? What about the stuff that's not just nonsense and noise? What about the actual individual pressuring by the president of officials that they should falsify the election results? If you or I did that, we'd be indicted. The president has not just done this once or twice. The president is now doing this as a matter of course in his daily work as president. The Washington Post just reported within the past hour, it's now 3 different states where the president has personally leaned on and pressured state officials who have some responsibility for handling election results. He has leaned on them and pressured them, again, in 3 states, to try to get those officials to falsify the election results in those states, to say Trump won instead of Biden. It is apparently not just Michigan, which we saw 2.5 weeks ago, where he brought Republican state legislators to the White House ahead of Michigan certifying its results to pressure those legislators, apparently, into trying to insert themselves into that process to stop the formalization of the vote, to interfere with Michigan declaring correctly its election results as a Biden win. It's not just Michigan. It's also not just Georgia, where the president this weekend called Georgia's governor and told him he needed to have the state legislature overturn Biden's victory in Georgia and call it instead for Trump. According to the Washington Post tonight, it's not just Michigan and it's not just Georgia. It's also Pennsylvania, where, per the Post's new reporting, it has been twice in the past week where the president has called the Republican Speaker of the State House in Pennsylvania and told that speaker that he needs to figure out a way to throw out the Biden win in Pennsylvania and give the state to Trump instead. I realize it sounds quaint to point this out, but pressuring officials to falsify election results is a crime. I mean, that's election interference, right? If anybody else you knew was pressuring elections officials personally, leaning on them, weighing on them to try to get them to falsify the election results and say the other guy won, they'd be indicted. I mean, now, Spiro Agnew and Donald Trump are among the politicians who have occupied the White House, who have complicated the idea of whether or not a crime committed by someone in the White House still counts as a crime. But ignoring this stuff and pretending it's okay can't be the right solution here either. Joining us now is Andrew Weissmann. He was one of the lead prosecutors for special counsel Robert Mueller. He headed up the prosecution of Paul Manafort. His latest book, which is required reading, is called Where Law Ends: Inside the Mueller Investigation. Mr. Weissmann, it is a real pleasure to have you here tonight. Thanks very much.
Nice to be here, Rachel.
So, is it overstating the case to talk about election interference here, to talk about not just the president fighting to make sure that the election, that he has every chance of winning the election to the end, but actually pressuring election officials to falsify these results? To me, that puts this in the category of potentially criminal behavior.
So you're right on. I know that you like to say that you're not a lawyer and you turn to lawyers as guests, but your instincts are completely right here. So first, there are 2 types of statutes that are at issue here. One is very specific, and it relates to election interference, 18 U.S.C. 241 and 242. What's interesting historically is those statutes came about because of emancipated slaves and the concern that people were going to interfere with their votes. There are also general statutes, such as the statute that prohibits falsifying records, falsifying documents that you would submit to court, such as the election results or committing wire fraud or mail fraud. All of those are potentially involved here, depending on what the facts are. But pressuring state officials to falsely certify or to undermine correct votes is a federal crime. And that raises the issue that you really started on when you talked about Spiro Agnew, which is, are we a nation where those at the highest levels of this country will be held to account if they commit a federal crime? And it's also one reason it cannot be the case that it's constitutional for the president to pardon himself, because at this stage, he would be free to commit all sorts of election interference and then just pardon himself and avoid ever being held to account for that wrongdoing. And it's just impossible to think that that's something that the framers intended to be the result here.
I don't know what's happening with William Barr at the outgoing Justice Department, the Trump appointees at the Justice Department. I don't know what's happening with Mr. Barr personally. There's been a lot of reporting that he may leave. Eventually, and probably in pretty short order, we'll find out who Joe Biden's nominee is going to be to lead the Justice Department. Do you foresee a future in which line prosecutors somewhere in the Justice Department, in the U.S. Attorney's Office or at Main Justice, are asked to investigate something like this, to potentially bring charges against anybody involved in some of these schemes that the president appears to be personally pressing via phone and sometimes in person from the White House?
I would like to see that. I can't say that we're going to see that. There obviously is a lot of political pressure to move on, but to my mind, particularly if the Manhattan District Attorney's Office does not bring an indictment, it's really important for the rule of law to apply not just to you and me, but to the very senior people, including the President of the United States. Other Western democracies, such as France and Israel, are facing that right now. We like to hold ourselves up as a nation where the rule of law applies even to the President of the United States. Well, we should then emulate France and Israel, where there are ongoing indictments now of current and former presidents. But I fear that if the Manhattan District Attorney's Office does make a case, it will provide an out for the next Attorney General to say that that is sufficient vindication of that interest, given the harms that would come and the disruption to the country of pursuing the former president criminally at the federal level.
Yeah. I feel like, having dug in so deeply into the Spiro Agnew story, that dynamic that you're describing there, that if there is some way to avoid those very difficult constitutional confrontations, if there is some way to avoid having to tread new ground that's never been trod before, the Justice Department will find some way to avoid it, even a well-run Justice Department with somebody principled at the helm. But the very basic questions of justice here are much simpler than all those complex calculations. Andrew Weissmann, former lead prosecutor for Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, the crime of obstructing a special counsel is one where it's really important that that be vindicated in some way, because it really means if you don't vindicate that, there's no point in appointing another special counsel going forward.
That's right. And once it's documented and you've let it go, you've set a precedent that it's de facto legal for the next person to do it too. Exactly. Andrew Weissmann, it's great to see you, my friend. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thank you.